The day started like any other for Officer Megan Hale, a seasoned officer of 8 years with the city's Metropolitan Police Force. With her blonde hair neatly tied back and her badge shining brightly against her crisp blue uniform, Megan hit the streets, prepared for another uneventful shift. As she cruised through the familiar avenues of the city, a part of her had long grown used to the routine traffic stops, minor disturbances, the occasional drunk driver. Little did she know, this particular day would take her down a path of unimaginable consequence. The city had been tense lately. There were growing reports of increased criminal activity, and the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface were threatening to boil over. A recent spike in gang violence had the police on edge, leading to heightened security measures and quick decisions on the streets. Megan had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to make snap judgments without letting fear or prejudice cloud her judgment. However, even the most controlled individuals can find themselves trapped in circumstances that spiral out of control. It was around noon when Megan spotted a sleek, black SUV driving slightly over the speed limit. Her police instincts kicked in. The windows of the SUV were tinted, making it impossible to see the driver. She thought back to the recent briefing the department had warned officers to be on the lookout for suspicious vehicles, especially those that fit the profile of drug transporters. With a quick flick of her wrist, she activated her siren and signaled for the car to pull over. As the SUV slowed and came to a stop by the curb, Megan felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. She parked behind the vehicle and took a deep breath. Calm, composed, her hand hovered over her radio as she approached the car, her fingers unconsciously tapping the grip of her holstered gun. Inside the car, Captain Elijah Brooks, a 20-year veteran of the force, sat behind the wheel. A tall, imposing figure with deep brown skin and short-cropped hair. Elijah had just finished a meeting at City Hall where he had been discussing new reforms aimed at improving police-community relations. He was tired but hopeful. Elijah had been one of the most outspoken advocates for change within the force, using his rank and influence to push for greater accountability and transparency. Unaware that he was being pulled over, Elijah casually checked his phone for messages when the flashing red and blue lights caught his attention. His first reaction was surprise. Was he speeding? He glanced at his speedometer, but it hadn't seemed excessive. Shaking his head, he put his phone down and complied with the officer's instructions. Megan approached the driver's side window, her hand now resting fully on the butt of her firearm. She knocked on the glass, and as the window slid down, her eyes immediately fixed on Elijah. Something in her brain clicked, the subconscious association of the tinted windows, the expensive car, and the figure of a large black man behind the wheel. Without realizing it, Megan's posture stiffened, her body screaming caution. "License and registration, please," she said, her voice professional but strained. Elijah, sensing the tension in her tone, remained calm. His experience had taught him how to navigate these situations. He offered a friendly smile, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had been in this position before, stopped for no other reason than being a black man in a nice car. "Sure, officer," Elijah said, reaching into his glove compartment. As he did, he casually added, "I'm Captain Brooks with the Metro Police Department. Just finished a meeting at City Hall." The mention of his rank caused a flicker of confusion in Megan's eyes. Captain. She didn't know every captain on the force, but something about his demeanor began to disarm her suspicion. Still, her instincts, coupled with the training that emphasized caution, kept her guard up. "Just keep your hands where I can see them," Megan said sharply. Even though Elijah had done nothing wrong, Elijah complied, raising his hands slightly, his patience beginning to wane. "Officer," he said gently, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you call it in, you'll see that I'm..." Before he could finish, another patrol car pulled up behind Megan's, its siren blaring. A younger officer, Officer Carl Barnes, exited his vehicle and approached quickly, his hand already on his gun. Megan shot him a glance, signaling him to hold back, but it was too late. Carl was new to the force, fresh out of the academy, and had already developed a reputation for being overly aggressive in his pursuit of justice. "What's going on here, Megan? Everything okay?" Kyle asked, eyeing Elijah suspiciously. "Yeah, just a routine stop," Megan replied, trying to de-escalate the situation. She could sense the tension rising, the air thick with unspoken danger. But Kyle, eyes narrowing, wasn't satisfied with her answer. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," he barked, pulling his gun halfway out of his holster. Elijah's heart raced. He was no stranger to police encounters, but this one was different. The aggression in Carl's voice, the nervous energy radiating from Megan, it all pointed to something more dangerous than a simple traffic stop. Elijah, trying to keep his cool, glanced at Megan. "Officer, I'm Captain Brooks. You don't need to do this," he said, his voice steady but firm. But Carl wasn't listening. His hand gripped his gun tighter, his eyes locked on Elijah's every movement. Megan felt her own heart pounding in her chest. She had to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "Kyle, stand down." Before she could finish, Elijah made a slow, deliberate move to open his door, trying to comply with Carl's demand. But in the split second that his hand reached for the handle, Carl panicked. "No, don't do it," Carl shouted, drawing his weapon fully and firing in rapid succession. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the street, followed by a deafening silence. Elijah slumped back in his seat, his eyes wide with shock, as blood began to stain his crisp, white shirt. Megan stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. She rushed forward, her hands shaking as she tried to check Elijah's pulse. But it was too late. Captain Elijah Brooks, one of the most respected members of the police force, was dead. Megan stumbled back, her mind racing. How had it come to this? How had a routine traffic stop turned into a fatal tragedy? She looked over at Kyle, who stood there, gun still in hand, his face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. The city would soon learn of the shooting, and the consequences would be catastrophic. News of a black police captain being shot by his own force would ignite the already simmering tensions in the community. Protests would erupt, the city would burn, and the police department would find itself under scrutiny like never before. Megan's career was over. Carl would face charges, but none of that mattered now, because Elijah Brooks, a man who had dedicated his life to improving the force and bridging the divide between police and community, was gone. And the worst part, it could have all been avoided. The air outside the car was thick with tension, and the reality of what had just transpired weighed heavily on Megan's chest. She stood there, numb, watching as Carl slowly lowered his gun, still shaking from the adrenaline that surged through his body. His face was pale, almost ghost-like, and his eyes locked on Elijah's lifeless body slumped in the driver's seat. Megan's mind raced. She replayed the events in her head. How had this escalated so fast? She had been in control, or at least she thought she had been. But in a matter of seconds, the situation had spun completely out of her hands. She knelt down beside Elijah, trying desperately to find any sign of life. Her fingers felt for a pulse at his neck, but there was nothing. His eyes, once full of strength and determination, were now staring blankly into the void. "Kyle, what have you done?" Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. Carl didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen in place, his gun still hanging loosely in his hand, as if he hadn't fully comprehended what had just happened. His training had failed him, his instincts betraying him at the worst possible moment. The shock of the event paralyzed him, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the distant hum of city life and the faint trickle of blood dripping onto the floor of the SUV. Megan fumbled with her radio, her hands shaking. She needed to call it in. The department had to be notified immediately, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, she pressed the button. "Officer down. Officer down," Megan's voice cracked. "We have a 10 to 54. Suspect is. She hesitated. How could she even begin to explain what had just happened? There was a long pause before the dispatcher's voice crackled back over the radio. 10 to 4, Ems en route. Hold your position." Megan knew that the nightmare was only just beginning. She glanced at Kyle again, who had slowly lowered his gun back into its holster. His face was pale, almost lifeless, as if the gravity of what he had done was just starting to sink in. I didn't mean to," Kyle stammered, his voice trembling. He moved too fast. "I thought." Megan's stomach twisted in knots. She had to keep it together. There would be investigations, press conferences, protests, hell, riots. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was that a man was dead, a respected captain of the force. A man who had dedicated his life to justice and reform was gone because of a terrible, tragic mistake. "Shut up, Kyle," Megan muttered under her breath, her voice barely hiding the anger and disgust she felt toward him. "Just shut up." She looked back at the SUV, at the lifeless body of Captain Elijah Brooks, and the weight of what this meant began to press down on her like a crushing wave. The media would devour this story, the public would demand answers, and the department, already on edge from heightened tensions between police and the community, would face an unprecedented crisis. But none of that could undo what had happened. Elijah was dead, and there was no bringing him back. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, media outlets were plastering Elijah Brooks' face across every screen, and the headline blared the same chilling message: Black police captain shot and killed by fellow officers. By nightfall, the city was in a state of chaos. Protests erupted almost immediately, the streets filling with angry voices calling for justice. The already fragile relationship between the police force and the community that was sworn to protect shattered completely. Megan watched the news from the briefing room at the precinct. Her eyes glazed over as she stared at the chaos unfolding on the screen. The protesters were angry, and rightfully so. Elijah Brooks had been a symbol of progress, a man who fought to bridge the gap between the force and the community. His death was more than a tragedy, it was a betrayal. The mayor held an emergency press conference, flanked by the police commissioner and several high-ranking officials. Their expressions were grim, their words carefully chosen, but nothing they said could quell the growing unrest. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into the events surrounding Captain Brooks' death," the commissioner said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "This was an unfortunate tragedy, and we are fully committed to ensuring that justice is served." But the words rang hollow. Megan could feel the tide turning. She knew how these things played out, how quickly public trust could erode. The people wouldn't be satisfied with platitudes and promises of an internal investigation. They wanted blood, and Megan knew it would come. Days later, the internal investigation began. Megan was called into the precinct early that morning, her stomach in knots as she prepared to give her statement. She had replayed the events of that day over and over in her head, trying to figure out what went wrong. Every time she came to the same conclusion: Kyle had panicked. But could she say that? Could she throw a fellow officer under the bus, knowing that it would ruin his life and career? She sat in the cold, sterile room across from internal affairs investigators, her hands trembling as she took a sip of water. The investigators were calm, methodical, asking question after question as they pieced together the timeline of events. "Officer Hale, at what point did you realize that the individual you pulled over was Captain Brooks?" one of the investigators asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Megan swallowed hard. "He told me when I asked for his license and registration. I didn't recognize him at first. His car had tinted windows, and I didn't know." "And when did Officer Barnes arrive on the scene?" "Just after I made contact with Captain Brooks," Megan replied, her voice shaky. "He pulled up behind me and things escalated quickly." The investigator's pen scratched across his notepad, the sound grating against Megan's already frazzled nerves. "Were you aware of Officer Barnes' tendencies toward aggressive behavior during traffic stops?" Megan hesitated. She had heard rumors about Kyle's temper, about how he was too quick to pull his gun in tense situations, but she never thought it would come to this. She didn't know how much of the blame she could shoulder herself. "I knew he was enthusiastic about his work," Megan said carefully, choosing her words with precision, "but I didn't expect him to react the way he did." The room fell silent for a moment as the investigators exchanged glances. Megan could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Could this have been prevented? As the investigation progressed, public outrage grew to a fever pitch. The protests, which had started out as peaceful demonstrations, quickly turned violent. Buildings were vandalized, police cars were set ablaze, and the streets became a battleground. The city, already fractured, was now on the verge of collapse. The police department was forced to issue a city-wide curfew, but it only fueled the flames of anger. In the eyes of many, the curfew was just another sign that the system was trying to silence them, trying to sweep the death of Captain Brooks under the rug. Megan watched helplessly as her world fell apart. She received death threats. Her name splashed across social media as the officer responsible for the tragedy. People demanded that she be fired, that she be held accountable, even though she hadn't pulled the trigger. As the investigation concluded, the inevitable happened. Charges were filed. Both Megan and Carl were put on administrative leave. As the legal battle loomed, public pressure demanded a trial, and the district attorney, feeling the weight of political and social forces, pushed forward with manslaughter charges against Carl. Megan, though not charged with any crime, was subpoenaed as a key witness in the case. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. News cameras lined the steps outside, broadcasting the proceedings to a nation that had become enthralled by the tragedy. People gathered outside, holding signs, chanting for justice. Inside, Megan sat on the witness stand, her hands shaking as she recounted the events of that fateful day once again. This time under oath. Carl sat at the defense table, his head hung low. He was a broken man, his career shattered, his future uncertain. The weight of Elijah Brooks' death hung around his neck like a noose. His defense attorney argued that it was a tragic accident, that Carl had acted in the heat of the moment, believing his life was in danger. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a reckless officer, unfit for duty, who had allowed his fear and prejudice to take a life. Megan found herself caught between two worlds: her loyalty to the force and her moral obligation to the truth. She had spent years upholding the law, believing in the justice system, but now she was a part of something far bigger than herself. The system she believed in was on trial, and she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter the outcome, the damage had already been done. Officer Hale, the prosecutor's voice broke through her thoughts. In your own words, can you explain what you saw when Officer Barnes drew his weapon? Megan took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I saw him reach for his gun after Captain Brooks reached for his head. He was moving fast, and I guess Carl thought he was going for a weapon. But he wasn't. He was just trying to comply with my order. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick in the air. Megan's words hung there, unspoken truths lingering between the lines. Carl's defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing the impact of her testimony. And did you believe at any time that Captain Brooks posed a threat to you or Officer Barnes? The prosecutor pressed. No, Megan replied, her voice steady. He wasn't a threat. Carl's eyes met Megan's from across the room, a look of betrayal flickering in his gaze. She had just sealed his fate, and they both knew it. The trial dragged on 4 weeks, the media scrutinizing every word, every piece of evidence. Outside, the protests had grown even more violent. Buildings were being set on fire, police barricades were torn down, and the city was devolving into chaos. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was just as tense. Megan watched from the gallery as the jury filed back into the courtroom for the days of deliberation. Her heart pounded in her chest, her stomach a knot of anxiety. She had been on trial too, in the court of public opinion. But today it was Carl's fate that hung in the balance. The foreman stood, holding the small piece of paper that contained Carl's future. The judge asked for the verdict, and the room fell deathly silent. On the charge of manslaughter in the death of Captain Elijah Brooks, the foreman began, "We find the defendant guilty." A murmur swept through the crowd. The Brooks family, sitting in the front row, held each other tightly. Carl's mother, seated behind him, let out a soft sob. Carl didn't react, he just stared straight ahead, numb, as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him completely. Megan felt her chest tighten. She had expected this outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Carl was going to prison. The city was still on fire, and Elijah Brooks was still dead. There was no justice here, only pain and destruction. The night of the verdict, the city exploded. What had been protests escalated into full-blown riots. Buildings were looted, cars overturned and set ablaze. The police, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the unrest, were unable to contain the violence. National Guard units were deployed, but the chaos seemed unstoppable. Megan watched from her apartment window as the flames licked the sky, turning the city she loved into a war zone. She had been advised to lay low, to avoid the public eye for her own safety. She was no longer an officer, not really. Her name had become synonymous with the tragedy, and she was a pariah to both the public and the force. Her phone buzzed on the table, another death threat, she assumed. They had been coming in steadily since the trial began. She ignored it, her focus drawn to the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the streets. The violence was escalating, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Elijah Brooks had been a symbol of hope, a man who dedicated his life to bridging the divide between the police and the community. Now, his death had shattered that hope, and the city was left in ruins. Megan sank into the couch, her head in her hands. She had never imagined that her career, her life, would end like this. She had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing. But now, justice felt like an illusion, something that existed only in theory, not in practice. There was no right thing anymore, only survival. The day of Elijah Brooks' funeral was grey and overcast, fitting for the somber occasion. The entire police department was in attendance, along with hundreds of community members who had come to pay their respects. The air was thick with grief and anger, a dangerous combination that threatened to boil over at any moment. Megan stood at the back of the crowd, her police uniform pressed and pristine, but she felt out of place. She wasn't sure she deserved to be there. Elijah had been a good man, a man she had respected, but now she was a part of the system that had taken his life. The eulogies were heartbreaking. Fellow officers, friends, and family members spoke of Elijah's dedication, his commitment to justice, and his tireless efforts to reform the system from within. But there was an unspoken tension in the air, a palpable sense that his death had been in vain. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Megan felt a tear slide down her cheek. She hadn't cried throughout the trial, throughout the protests, but now, standing here, she couldn't hold it back anymore. Elijah was gone, and the world felt darker without him. Weeks after the funeral, the city was still reeling. The riots had finally subsided, but the scars they left behind were deep and lasting. Businesses were destroyed, families displaced, and the trust between the community and the police was shattered beyond repair. Megan had resigned from the force. She couldn't continue. The weight of everything that had happened was too much to bear. She couldn't face the public, couldn't face herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elijah's face, lifeless in the driver's seat, and Carl's shaking hands holding the gun. The final blow came when Megan learned that Carl, just days after his conviction, had taken his own life in his jail cell. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. Carl had been flawed, yes, but he wasn't a monster. He had made a terrible mistake, and now, 2 lives were lost because of it. Megan felt a deep, aching sorrow settle in her chest. The system had failed everyone: Elijah, Carl, the community, and herself. There were no winners here, only victims. As the days passed, Megan withdrew further into herself. She had lost everything: her career, her sense of purpose, her belief in the system she had once trusted so deeply. The city had been torn apart, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. One evening, as the sun set over the smoldering remains of the city, Megan walked through the streets, aimless. She passed by the precinct, now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The weight of the tragedy pressed down on her, and for the first time in her life, She didn't know what to do. There was no going back, no undoing the damage that had been done. She stood at the edge of the bridge, looking out over the dark, churning water below. The world felt impossibly heavy, and Megan, in that moment, wondered if she would ever find peace again.
Thank you for watching. Leave your opinions on this story in the comments. As well, you can watch our other videos.